Thank you all so much for coming to see this presentation. This is joint work with Alok Kumar and Vidi Chowchary, also from Miami. And here we're going to talk about the effect of diversity on minority analysts. And to sort of preface this, I mean, there have been quite a few, of course, recent historical developments when things come to diversity, but this one was just a bit too much on the nose, I think. This is an article in New York Times last summer, the summer of 2020, where the African-American head of diversity of Morgan Stanley got fired by Morgan Stanley for promoting African-American diversity. So by the point where you're firing the person for doing the thing they're supposed to be doing, something is clearly off. But generally, there's been a lot of concern about diversity in financial services, as well as, of course, in many other areas. So we thought this would be an interesting thing to check out. So to sort of motivate this, first of all, some descriptive stats. Generally, diversity has been on the rise. That sounds good, right? So when we look at the average non-white participation in brokerages by analysts, we see that the fraction of non-white analysts is indeed going up over time from about 20% in the 80s to about now 40%, depending on whether you weight brokerages with more or fewer analysts differently, about 40%. Interestingly, though, this is not sort of uniform. So if you count, for example, the proportion of Asian analysts, there's perhaps even a stronger rise from literally less than 1% in the 80s to now 25%. But on the other hand, and this I think gets at this idea of what was going on with Morgan Stanley, the proportion of African-American analysts has actually been declining. So it started at about 12%, and now it is about under 8% on average. So clearly there's some interesting dynamics in diversity. That's sort of what, to us, merits a deeper look. Now, there's, of course, been the Black Lives Matter movement. There's generally been an emphasis, some of it you've seen around you in academia, in other areas as well, attention to diversity. And there's sort of some theoretical, well-posed pros and cons to diversity. There's, of course, more potential for conflict due to differences in opinion. But at the same time, there's more potential for creativity, well, due to those same differences in opinion. So it's sort of a double-edged sword, no matter where you apply it. But quantifying these effects of diversity in financial services, well, I think has for now been primarily relegated to boards. So here we're going to look at analysts. So why sell-side equity analysts? Well, first of all, just because there's a lot of them, we can identify their ethnicity. They work in groups at a brokerage. Therefore, we can create a measure of the diversity of this brokerage. And we can ask the following set of questions. First of all, are minority analysts actually better or worse at their job? Do only higher quality minority analysts enter the profession? Maybe because of some barriers to entry like discrimination. Is there a distinct forecasting style? Is diversity actually good for minorities? That's sort of, I think, our most fundamental question. And as a preview, the answer turns out to be no. And how are they sort of perceived in the internal labor market and in the external market to which they provide opinion as sell-side analysts? So there is actually a substantial difference in forecasting styles by analysts from different ethnic backgrounds. As I just alluded to earlier, diversity does not help minority analysts, which is in a way contrary to some of this, these aims of promoting diversity, I think. And interestingly, higher diversity actually helps the white analysts more. Career outcomes of Asian analysts are actually harmed by increases in diversity. And stock market participants don't seem to be as influenced by analyst background. Now, where do we get our data from? Well, obviously, IBS, that's sort of the go-to source for all things analyst. We have almost 20 years of data. We've got about 800,000 analyst firm year observations, about 20,000 analysts covering about 20,000 firms. We generally look at the EPS estimate as sort of the measure of what the analyst is doing, but we also look at revisions. Some more summary stats. An analyst covers about 17 firms on average across 4 industries on average. They've covered the same firm for 3 years. They've got 10 years of experience. Their colleague pool is about 60 analysts total, well, meaning that there's 59 other individuals. They are 12% likely to, at some point in their career, be named to a fairly prestigious list of all-star analysts. And their demographics are broadly reflective of the US population. About 76% of them are white, 8% are Asian, 9% African American, 4% Hispanic. Now, perhaps the most sort of pressing question to you might be, how do we actually infer what ethnicity and diversity are? And the way that we do this is by going to the census. So in the 2010 census, there were about 295 million respondents. And what the government's done is it's actually put out statistics by last name of how many respondents self-identified as having a certain ethnicity by each name. Therefore, what we can actually do is simply match names and infer a race or ethnicity likelihood for each particular analyst, just sort of as a random draw from the US population. So for example, if your name is Smith, well, that means that of all the people in the US named Smith, 71% are white, 23% are African American, 2.4% are Hispanic. Therefore, without knowing anything else, we would assume that such an analyst is 71% likely to. But this approach actually has, I think, another sort of superior feature when it comes to sort of more ambiguous names. So think about a name like Lee, where in the census, it seems about evenly split between whites and Asian Americans. And while, of course, one could say, well, we could remove all ambiguity by looking this person up on LinkedIn, actually seeing whether they are white or Asian American, the thing is that market participants, and in fact, people who have never seen this particularly, would not be able to do this themselves. So in a way, this ambiguity in the census data, I think, reflects correctly the ambiguity that people themselves would perceive when reading a sell-side analyst report by a person named Lee. Maybe they're white, maybe they're Asian. Generally, we'll do regressions, both linear and probit, on this about 20 years of data. We will include a standard set of control variables for the analyst literature, things like how far out a forecast is being made, how many firms the analyst covers, how many industries the analyst covers, how much experience they have, both in the firm they're providing the EPS forecast for and broadly, how big their brokerage is, are they one of these prestigious all-stars in a particular year, and what their error has been historically. And the main variable of sort of accuracy we'll focus on is this one. It's standard in the literature, the PMAFE, where you take the average forecast error by a particular analyst, and you take it relative to the forecast error of all the other analysts providing EPS estimates for the same firm. So that sort of controls for pretty much everything else going on about that firm, such as its opacity. Basically, how much better are you doing than everybody else who's trying to do the same thing? So if we look at this analyst error, sort of our first order question is, well, does ethnicity matter? And it It does. So if you look at white analysts, their forecast error relative to all the other analysts is actually lower, highly statistically significantly so. Asian analysts, their error is actually higher, and again, highly statistically significant. And these are sort of with all of those analyst and brokerage controls. We can also combine all of the probabilities together. Obviously, we have to exclude one, so we exclude the probability of white, just to sort of see an effect relative to a baseline, I guess in this case, white analyst. But we don't really have a sense of what might be causing this.
Oh, 5 minutes, okay?
Thank you. So what about self-selection? Could it be the case that only some types of minority analysts actually go into the profession? Might that be one possibility? It's one that we can almost rule out. In other words, if you just look at the accuracy of analysts in their first few years of career, there's not a whole lot of difference across ethnicities. It only seems to really develop later. Of course, this could also be a consequence of a smaller sample size, but remember, we've got like 20,000 analysts, so that's perhaps less likely. So then we actually look at this idea of the interaction of diversity with ethnicity to see if that might help explain things. So we create several proxies of diversity within a brokerage. The first of these that I showed you the plot of in the beginning is just at the brokerage, what is the average non-white likelihood across all analysts? And we do a similar average likelihood of Asian ethnic origin at the brokerage, African American and Hispanic. We look also at a couple sort of population or information theory commonly used measures such as the Shannon index and the Blau index, where we just sort of look at these average population proportions as a test of how non-uniform or how uniform they are. Generally, the results are consistent across all of these, except of course for the ethnicity specific types of diversity. So if we go back to our idea of forecast accuracy and now add an interaction of ethnicity with diversity, we actually see where, for example, this seeming advantage that white analysts have comes from. It's not just so much the probability of a particular analyst being white. It's actually that if you're a white analyst at a diverse brokerage, that's where you seem to do well, be more accurate. And that's an effect that seems to be quite statistically significant. For the others, diversity, at least when you measure it as non-white diversity, doesn't actually help them. So this sort of leads us to, I think, the most important takeaway from the paper is that diversity may not be helping those whom it is designed to help, at least in this setting. What about the style of forecasting? We look at bold and bold positive and bold negative forecasts, just sort of like deviations above their previous forecasts. We don't see that ethnicity matters for boldness generally, but if we subset it out into directional boldness, we actually see it does. So Asian analysts are more likely to make bold positive forecasts, and African American analysts are more likely to make bold, or less likely to make bold positive. They're more likely to make bold negative forecasts. And if we look at the relation with brokerage diversity again, we see that again, this seems to be at least for African American analysts mediated by the diversity of brokerage, where it's really African American analysts at more diverse brokerages that seems to be driving this. In the interests of time, I'll simply show you some of the other results quickly, but of course the paper has quite a few of them. The paper is primarily still at a descriptive stage because it's really hard to come up with a mechanism that is testable for how diversity might impact analyst behavior, but not a very strong effect on promotion, though a slight favorability for white analysts. But if you look at white analysts in diverse brokerages, again, you see a very strong relation that white analysts at diverse brokerages are more likely to be promoted. And in fact, Asian analysts at more diverse brokerages are less likely to be promoted. Market reaction, not a tremendous amount, though. When Asian analysts make revisions, they actually do receive a greater market reaction. And similarly for bold forecasts. For sample exit, we see that whites unconditionally are more likely to exit the sample to stop being an analyst. Hispanics are less likely to do so. But of course, remember that exit could be sort of twofold. If you exit from the sell side, maybe you're going over to the buy side, or maybe you're leaving financial analysis for good. But when it comes to the role of diversity here again, we see that indeed for whites, they are much less likely to leave the sample in diverse brokerages. Asian analysts are much more likely to leave the sample in diverse brokerages. No real effect for Hispanic analysts, conditional on diversity there. And the effects are mostly concentrated in competitive brokerages. So there's an idea that maybe a more competitive environment could be good for the benefits of diversity, or it could be the other way around. We see that these effects are actually prevalent primarily in the most competitive brokerages. So to sum up, we've got general results on forecast accuracy, with white analysts actually being more accurate. Asian analysts are more likely to issue bold positive forecasts. So diversity and ethnicity do seem to affect sort of the dissemination of information in the US capital markets. Diversity helps white analysts. That I think is again maybe the most important, or one of the more important points of this paper, that it's not necessarily helping the groups that may be designed to help. And generally, the effects of diversity are stronger in more competitive brokerages. So that is our story thus far. Thank you so much for listening. I look forward to the discussion.